Well, good morning to you, church, and to all you who find yourselves watching this video online. Welcome to this Friday's Devotions from a Distance. It all started with a clunk, and when I heard it, I knew immediately that something was wrong. It was a beautiful Friday evening. The sky was blue, the breeze was warm, and I was on my way to the Roland golf course to show my buddies yet once again what a real golfer looked like. And that's when it happened. Clunk! Immediately, the dashboard in front of me lit up like a Christmas tree, and the engine temperature skyrocketed. Now, I'm no mechanic, but I knew enough to pull over or risk ruining the engine any further. But the reality that I had to come to terms with in that moment was that I was 20 minutes from home with a broken down car. It was essentially undrivable. It was unfit for use. My car in that moment could be understood as a representation of the world that we live in now. It is no secret that our world is a messy and broken place. It does not take a degree in rocket science to understand that the way that things are now with sickness and with evil is not the way that God designed them to be. In Genesis 1, as God creates the earth and all that is in it, he finishes each creative session by standing back and marveling at the things that he just created. It is good, he continues to declare verse by verse. Everything that God created, every animal, every plant, every bug, was stamped with his approval. The earth was humming along according to God's good plan. That is, until Adam and Eve chose disobedience. Clunk. Soon after, Cain killed his brother Abel. Clunk again. And only 6 short chapters into the Bible, God describes sin to be out of control, rampant. He describes that the inclination of the human heart is only evil. The pandemic that we currently find ourselves in only serves to remind us of this clunk. We know deep within our souls that this is not how things are supposed to be. This is not how God designed our world to function. And so the words of Paul in Colossians 1, verse 16 to 17 gives us a clue to understanding this predicament. These are Paul's words. He says, "For by him," he's talking about Jesus, "for by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things were created by him," and catch this, "for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Now we can all agree that everything in the world was made by God. I don't think that's an argument. But then Colossians reminds us that everything is made for God. Now that's an interesting thought. Paul is making a large point with a very small word. For all things to be created for him implies that all things find their purpose in him. The things in the world are not simply for God to possess. They're not simply made so that God could own a piece of property as if he even had the need to. But rather, all things are created to serve a unique, God-appointed purpose within the whole of his grand design. Here's where we need to be a little bit careful, though. Some people may argue, well, if God created everything, does that mean that he created evil? If everything is created for a purpose, is it God's purpose to let evil abound in our world? If God created all things, did he create his own opposition? Well, the short answer to that is no. Remember my broken down car? Well, to ask these questions of God would be like if I were to phone the Chrysler headquarters and ask if my car was made for the purpose of breaking down. That would sound silly, wouldn't it? Although a broken down car may be the reality at the moment, it certainly wasn't the intended purpose that the engineers had for the car when they made it. They didn't build a car for the reason of stranding its driver miles from home. And in the same way, a messy and broken world is not an indication that God desired or that he created evil. But it does remind us that the purposes that God intended for us have been hindered by our sin. Paul doesn't end this thought here, though. In verse 18 to 22, he also presents the solution. This is what he says. And he, Jesus again, is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his faithfulness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish, and free from accusation. In Christ there is redemption for our broken world. The very purpose of Christ was to reconcile us to himself, that is, to right the wrongs of sin and to restore our purpose. Jesus is, in effect, the roadside mechanic that is sent to get the car running again, in order that it may once again serve its purpose. Just what is that purpose, though? Well, for us, it's to be properly human, holy, as Paul describes it, to once again stand at the place where heaven meets earth, and to be God's image bearers, proclaiming to the rest of creation God's glory and God's majesty. We won't eradicate sin in this life, but because of Jesus, we can live in harmony with God as he dwells in us. Thank you, church, and I hope you enjoy your weekend.